The rain fell like communion wine gone rancid, each droplet carrying the weight of 800 years of war. Private Matthias Vorn pressed his face against the mud-caked wall of Trench 77, listening to the wet percussion of artillery shells landing somewhere beyond the razor wire. The sound had become liturgy to him, each explosion a verse in the endless hymn of no man's land. Sergeant Casimir Thorne emerged from the communication bunker, his weathered face bearing the scars of shrapnel and faith. The brass insignia of the new syncretic Orthodox hung from his neck, tarnished green as old copper pennies found in plague graves. Behind him followed the remainder of 3rd Penitent Squad, Brother, Militant Jakob, whose left hand had been replaced with a mechanical claw blessed by the Shrine of the Martyrs, Corporal Dimitri, his throat marked with the ritual cuts of the Silent Vow, and Private Lucian, barely 18 summers, but already bearing the 1,000-yard stare of those who had gazed too long into the cratered reliquaries. "Orders from command," Thorne announced, his voice carrying the rasp of a man who had breathed too much consecrated smoke. "We advance to grid reference 7-7 Alpha at nightfall. Intelligence reports something in the old choir trench." The choir trench. Even the name carried weight among the penitent infantry. Built during the 3rd siege of New Antioch, it had housed the cantors of the Bleeding Crown, those blessed singers whose voices could turn enemy bullets to prayer beads and whose hymns could make dead men march. The trench had been abandoned 3 winters past after the Great Silence, when every voice within its walls had simply stopped mid-song, leaving only the echo of incomplete harmonies hanging in the air like smoke from burned scripture. Jakob flexed his mechanical fingers, each joint clicking like rosary beads. "What kind of something, Sergeant?" "Music," Thorne replied, spitting black phlegm into the mud. "Music that no one remembers writing." The words settled over the squad like grave dirt. In the trenches of the Trench Crusade, music was sacred. Each hymn approved by the Ecclesiastical War Council. Each note blessed by martyrs' blood. Unauthorized music was heresy. Unknown music was something far worse. Dimitri touched his throat wounds, the scar tissue white against his dirt-stained skin. Though he had taken the silent vow, his eyes spoke volumes. They had all heard the stories whispered in the medical tents, tales of melodies that could unpick a man's faith like loose threads, songs that could make holy water boil and blessed ammunition misfire. As twilight descended over the battlefield, the squad gathered their equipment. Bolt-action rifles, blessed with oil from the martyr's shrine, bandoliers of consecrated rounds, each cartridge inscribed with a prayer in the old tongue. Thorne carried the squad's relic engine, a crude mechanical device that hummed with barely contained sanctity, its bronze gears clicking out the rhythm of the 99 names of the Eternal Judge. The journey to grid reference 77 Alpha took them through the ruins of what had once been a monastery. The stone walls, blackened by alchemical fire, still bore fragments of illuminated manuscripts, their gold leaf peeling away like diseased skin. In the chapel, a statue of Saint Godfrey, the Martyr King, had been defaced by heretic legion saboteurs, its face carved away to reveal the raw stone beneath like exposed bone. Jakob paused at the altar, crossing himself with his mechanical hand. The gesture produced a sound like breaking twigs. "The air tastes wrong here," he muttered. It did taste wrong. Where battlefield air should carry the familiar copper tang of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder, here there was something else, something sweet and cloying, like incense mixed with decay. Matthias found himself breathing through his mouth, but even then, the taste coated his tongue like communion wine left too long in the chalice. Beyond the monastery ruins, the landscape opened into the scarred expanse of no man's land. Here, 8 centuries of warfare had transformed the earth into something unrecognizable. Craters filled with stagnant water reflected the diseased yellow of corpse candles, those strange lights that danced over battlefield graves when the moon was dark. The ground itself had taken on an oily black sheen, as if the soil had absorbed so much blood that it had begun to ferment. Thorn consulted his map, a piece of parchment so stained with mud and worse things that the grid lines resembled veins in diseased flesh. There. He pointed with a finger that bore the ritual brands of his rank. 200 yards northeast. The entrance should be marked with a shrine to Saint Polycarp the Throat, blessed. They found the shrine exactly where the map indicated, though the statue had been mutilated beyond recognition. Whatever had been done to it, the work was not the crude vandalism typical of heretic legion raiders. This was precise, surgical, as if someone had carefully removed specific parts while leaving others untouched. The saint's throat remained intact, carved marble lips slightly parted as if in mid-song, but everything above the neck had been carved away with methodical precision. The entrance to the choir trench yawned beside the shrine like a wound in the earth. Wooden support beams, rotted by moisture and time, framed the opening. Iron rails that had once carried supply carts disappeared into the darkness beyond, their metal surfaces corroded to a rust red that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. Lucian lit a blessed candle, its flame dancing wildly in the still air. The light revealed carved symbols along the tunnel walls, religious iconography intertwined with military engineering. Crosses and crescents marked firing positions, while verses from the Book of Sacred Warfare had been etched into support beams. But here and there, other marks appeared, symbols that none of them recognized, sigils that seemed to twist and writhe in the candlelight, as if the stone itself was alive. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, following the natural contours of the hillside. Water dripped from the ceiling with metronomic persistence, each drop landing with a sound like fingernails tapping against glass. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something organic and wrong. After perhaps 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. Here, the walls had been reinforced with stone blocks salvaged from nearby churches, their surfaces still bearing fragments of religious frescoes. Angels with wings like shattered stained glass gazed down at the squad with eyes that had been deliberately gouged out, while saints' faces had been scraped away to reveal the gray stone beneath. Thorn raised his hand, signaling the squad to halt. In the silence that followed, they could hear it. Music. It began as a whisper, so faint that at first Matthias thought it might be the wind moving through the tunnel system. But gradually, the sound resolved into something more structured, more intentional. Voices, human voices, singing in harmonies that made his teeth ache. The melody was complex, layered, each voice weaving around the others in patterns that seemed to follow no earthly musical theory. Christ's wounds. Jacob breathed, his mechanical hand clenching involuntarily. What language is that? None of them could say. The words, if they were words, seemed to shift and change even as they listened. Sometimes the sounds resembled the liturgical Latin used in Orthodox services, sometimes the ancient Greek of the earliest martyrs. sometimes languages that predated Christianity itself. But beneath the linguistic confusion, the emotional content was unmistakable. This was music of loss, of longing, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. They continued deeper into the trench system, following the sound through a maze of interconnected chambers. Here and there they found evidence of the choir's former occupants, sleeping alcoves carved into the walls, each marked with a different saint's name. A communal area, where benches arranged in semicircles faced a raised platform, storage rooms still containing hymnals, their pages swollen with moisture and fungus. But it was the personal effects that truly unsettled them. In one alcove they found a diary written in a trembling hand, its final entry dated 3 years past. The new song came to Brother Augustine in dreams. He says the Blessed Virgin taught it to him, but when he sings it, the communion wine turns black. Father Superior says we must practice it anyway. The war effort demands new weapons. In another sleeping chamber, Jakob discovered a collection of throat lozenges, each one carved from what appeared to be human bone and inscribed with tiny prayers. When he held one up to Lucian's candle, the flame guttered and nearly died, as if the very presence of the object consumed light. The music grew louder as they progressed deeper into the complex. Now they could distinguish individual voices within the chorus, each one distinct in its suffering. There was a tenor that rose and fell like a man drowning, a bass that rumbled with the sound of grinding stone, a soprano that peaked at frequencies that made their ears bleed. And beneath it all, a percussion that Matthias slowly realized was not instruments at all, but the sound of metal striking bone. They emerged into what must have been the main performance chamber. The space was vast, carved from the living rock of the hillside and reinforced with pillars that bore the carved likenesses of singing saints. Rows of stone benches faced a raised platform where a pipe organ of unusual design dominated the far wall. But this was no ordinary instrument. The pipes were not metal, but what appeared to be human throats, still pink and glistening with saliva, connected by a network of copper wires that pulsed with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. The music emanated from the organ itself, each throat producing its part of the horrible chorus. But there were gaps in the arrangement, dark spaces where pipes should have been but were not, creating holes in the harmony that made the entire composition sound incomplete, yearning, desperate. And seated at the organ's console was a figure in the tattered remains of a cantor's robes. His back was to them, hands moving across keys made of what looked like finger bones, his head swaying with the rhythm of the music. When he turned to face them, they saw that his throat had been open from ear to ear, the wound held apart by tiny silver hooks that gleamed in the candlelight. When he tried to speak, only music emerged, a wordless harmony that made their vision blur and their knees buckle. "Dear God," Thorne whispered, reaching for his rifle, but even as his hands found the weapon, he discovered that his body would not obey his commands. The music held them frozen, puppets dancing to a melody they could not resist. The organist gestured to the empty spaces in his instrument, his meaning clear. The choir was incomplete. New voices were needed. Fresh throats to replace those that had grown worn and cracked from endless performance. Lucian was the first to step forward, his young face slack with an expression of rapturous terror. His hands moved to his throat, fingers tracing the line where the cuts would be made. Behind him, Matthias felt his own body begin to move, drawn by the irresistible pull of the music. Only Jakob's mechanical hand remained under his own control. the blessed steel immune to the song's influence, but it was not enough to stop his legs from carrying him toward the platform. Sergeant Thorne tried to speak a prayer, but the words that emerged from his throat were not Latin but part of the song, his voice automatically finding its place in the deadly harmony. His relic engine sparked and smoked, its holy mechanisms unable to cope with the unhallowed music that surrounded them. As they climbed the steps to the platform, the organist's smile widened, revealing teeth filed to points. In the gaps between the existing throat pipes, they could see the surgical apparatus waiting. Silver scalpels, blessed by heretic priests, copper wire thin as spider silk, hooks designed to hold flesh in perfect singing position. The procedure would not kill them, the organist's expression promised. Death would be too merciful, too final. They would sing forever, their voices joining the eternal chorus of the damned. But, as Lucian reached the top of the platform, something unexpected happened. The young private's hand, moving as if of its own accord, found the blessed candle still clutched in his fingers. The flame, fed by his terror and desperation, suddenly blazed with a light that was not entirely earthly. For just a moment, the music faltered. In that instant of silence, Thorne found his voice. Not the words of the cursed song, but the opening lines of the canticle of St. Michael the Throat Severer, the prayer traditionally used to bless the vocal cords of military chaplains. His voice was cracked and broken, barely audible, but it was enough to create a tiny pocket of blessed silence in the ocean of damned sound. Jakob's mechanical hand responded to the prayer, its blessed mechanisms overriding the music's influence. He raised his rifle and fired, not at the organist, but at the copper wires connecting the throat pipes to their controlling mechanism. The blessed ammunition, inscribed with prayers against unholy influence, severed several connections, causing the corresponding throats to fall silent. But the damage was temporary. Even as the organic components of the instrument writhed and bled, new copper filaments began to grow from the wounds, reaching toward the severed connections like metallic tentacles. The music resumed, louder and more insistent than before, and now it carried a note of anger, of hunger denied. The organist turned toward Jacob, his wounded throat opening wider, and from the gaping wound emerged not blood but a swarm of tiny silver insects, each one singing in perfect pitch. They descended on the squad like a living cloud, their song penetrating not just their ears but their very souls, bypassing the crude defenses of flesh and bone to corrupt the spiritual essence beneath. Matthias felt his faith beginning to crack, 8 centuries of orthodox doctrine crumbling before the weight of the alien melody. He watched in horror as his hands began to move toward his throat, fingers already positioned to make the first incision. Beside him, Corporal Dimitri's silent vow was breaking down, his mouth opening to release sounds he had sworn never to make, wordless harmonies that blended seamlessly with the organ's deadly song. The blessed candle in Lucian's hand guttered and died, its flame consumed by the gathering darkness. Without its light, the chamber seemed to expand infinitely, the walls receding until they were singing in a vast cathedral of bone and wire, their voices echoing through spaces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal geometry. Thorne's relic engine finally exploded, its bronze gears unable to withstand the conflicting spiritual forces. The blast momentarily disrupted the music, but when the echoes faded, the song resumed with even greater intensity. Now other voices joined the chorus, the spirits of all who had died in this place over the centuries, their ghostly harmonies weaving through the melody like threads in a tapestry of the damned. One by one, the members of Third Penitent Squad stepped forward to take their place in the choir of nails. Lucian went first, his young voice pure and clear as the silver scalpel opened his throat. The hook slid into place with surgical precision, holding the wound open while copper wires threaded through the vocal cords like puppet strings. His eyes remained aware, conscious, even as his body became merely an instrument for the organist's use. Jakob followed, his mechanical hand continuing to twitch and spark even as his organic throat was prepared for its new purpose. The blessed steel of his prosthetic fought against the corruption, sending cascades of holy sparks through his nervous system, but in the end, even divine machinery could not stand against the weight of accumulated damnation. Dimitri's transformation was perhaps the most horrific, as his throat had already been scarred by his silent vow. The organist had to cut deeper, carving through scar tissue that had been sanctified by years of voluntary silence. When the hooks finally found purchase, Dimitri's voice emerged not as song but as a prolonged scream that somehow harmonized perfectly with the existing chorus. Matthias watched it all happen, powerless to resist, his own feet carrying him inexorably toward the platform. He could feel the scalpel's touch against his throat, cold as winter rain, sharp as the edge of paradise. The hooks slid home with barely any pain, their blessed silver somehow making the mutilation feel like communion. But it was Sergeant Thorne's turn that revealed the true horror of their situation. As the eldest, as the one who had led them into this trap, he was given the position of highest honor in the choir. The organist gestured to a special pipe, larger than the others, positioned at the very center of the instrument. This throat was ancient, withered, its voice cracked and broken from centuries of use. It belonged to the original cantor of the Bleeding Crown, the man who had first discovered the cursed melodies that had damned them all. The old throat was carefully removed, its copper connections severed with ceremonial precision. In its place, Thorne's throat was installed, his voice immediately taking up the central melody that had been incomplete for so long. With their sergeant's rich baritone anchoring the composition, the song reached its full power for the first time in decades. The chamber shook with the force of the completed choir, dust raining down from the ceiling as the very stones themselves began to sing in harmony. Outside, they could hear the sounds of battle changing, the familiar percussion of artillery replaced by something more rhythmic, more musical. The entire war was beginning to dance to their tune. Through the throat pipes that had been their vocal cords, the members of Third Penitent Squad could see everything that their song was accomplishing. Across no man's land, soldiers on both sides were beginning to move in unison, their battles taking on the characteristics of elaborate choreography. In the shrine of the martyrs, holy relics were beginning to tarnish and corrupt, their blessed properties inverting under the influence of the diabolic harmony. In New Antioch, the great cathedral bells were tolling in rhythm with the choir of nails, their bronze tongues moving to patterns that had nothing to do with the canonical hours. Priests found themselves unable to complete their prayers, their voices automatically shifting to harmonize with the distant song. The communion wine in every chalice turned black as sin, while the blessed bread crumbled to ash in the mouths of the faithful. But the song was still not complete. Even with 5 new voices added to its ranks, gaps remained in the composition. The organist's fingers danced across the bone keys, calling for more singers, more throats, to join the eternal chorus. And from the tunnels that led back to the surface, they could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, drawn by the irresistible pull of the music. A patrol of Hebrew knights had discovered the entrance to the choir trench, their blessed armor ringing like bells as they descended toward the source of the sound. Behind them came a squad of trench pilgrims, their faces hidden behind masks carved from martyrs' bones, their footsteps keeping perfect time with the diabolic rhythm. Even soldiers from enemy factions were approaching, heretic legionnaires whose allegiance to dark powers had made them sensitive to unholy music, and damned Templars whose corruption ran so deep that they actively sought out sources of spiritual poison. All of them were drawn by the song, all of them helpless to resist its call. The organist smiled wider, his filed teeth gleaming in the phosphorescent light that now emanated from the throat pipes themselves. Soon the choir would be complete, every voice perfectly in tune, every harmony exactly as it should be. And then the real work could begin, the great song that would remake the world, that would transform the endless war into something beautiful and terrible and eternal. Through their transformed throats, the members of 3rd Penitent Squad tried to scream warnings, tried to break free from the copper wires that held their vocal cords in thrall. But their voices could only produce the sounds that the organist's fingers demanded, their individual identities subsumed into the greater musical whole. They watched in horror as the first of the Hebrew knights reached the performance chamber, his blessed sword dropping from nerveless fingers as the music took hold of his soul. His armor, inscribed with protective prayers in ancient Hebrew, began to tarnish and corrupt, the holy words reshaping themselves into something older and more sinister. The knight's helmet was removed with careful precision, revealing a face marked with ritual scars that spoke of a lifetime spent in service to the divine. But as the silver scalpel approached his throat, those scars began to writhe and change, transforming from symbols of faith into sigils of damnation. One by one, the new arrivals took their place in the expanding choir. Each voice added new dimensions to the song, new harmonies that revealed previously hidden aspects of the composition. The Hebrew knights brought martial precision to the music, their voices cutting through the harmony like blessed blades. The trench pilgrims added a note of fanatical devotion, their throats producing sounds that spoke of willing sacrifice to causes beyond human understanding. But it was the arrival of the heretic legionnaires that truly elevated the performance. Their voices, already corrupted by years of exposure to diabolic influence, blended seamlessly with the existing chorus, adding depths of malice and cruelty that had been missing from the composition. When they sang, the very air around them seemed to darken, while images of unspeakable acts flickered in the phosphorescent glow of the throat pipes. The damned Templars brought something else entirely, a note of tragic nobility, a sound of good intentions twisted into something monstrous. Their voices carried echoes of the oaths they had once sworn, the sacred vows that had been perverted into their current form. When they joined the choir, every throat pipe began to weep tears of blood, the salt mixing with the copper wires to create compounds that glowed with unholy light. As the choir expanded, so did its influence. The song was now powerful enough to reach beyond the confines of the trench system, its vibrations traveling through the earth itself to emerge in distant battlefields. Across the war-torn landscape, entire regiments found themselves marching in time to the diabolic rhythm, their movements coordinated by a will that was not their own. In the command bunkers of both sides, generals studying their maps discovered that their strategic plans were changing without their conscious input, battle formations shifting to create patterns that resembled musical notation when viewed from above. The war itself was becoming a physical manifestation of the choir of Nail's composition, every explosion and artillery barrage timed to coincide with specific notes in the endless song. But still, the organist was not satisfied. His fingers moved across the bone keys with increasing urgency, calling for more voices, more harmonies to complete his masterwork. And from the deepest tunnels of the trench system, things that had been sleeping for centuries began to stir. They emerged from chambers that predated the Christian era, creatures that had been old when Rome was young. Some wore the tattered remains of Byzantine vestments, others the armor of Crusader knights who had fallen during the original siege of Jerusalem. All of them bore the marks of the choir of Nails, their throats opened and wired in the same fashion as the more recent additions. These ancient singers brought with them melodies that had been forbidden since the early days of the Church, harmonies that spoke of gods whose names had been deliberately forgotten, of rituals that predated the concept of sin itself. When their voices joined the chorus, the very foundations of Christian doctrine began to shake, sacred truths inverting into their opposite meanings. The throat pipes themselves began to change, the pink flesh darkening to deeper hues while metallic veins spread across their surface like infection. Some developed additional vocal folds, allowing them to produce multiple notes simultaneously. Others sprouted tiny fangs that clicked together in rhythmic patterns, adding percussion to the endless song. Through it all, the members of 3rd Penitent Squad maintained some vestige of their individual consciousness, trapped within their transformed bodies like prisoners in cells of flesh and wire. They could see everything, understand everything, but were powerless to act according to their own will. Their voices belonged to the organist now, their souls pledged to the service of his diabolic composition. They witnessed the arrival of more and more singers, each one adding new complexity to the ever-expanding choir. Starlit cultists emerged from hidden passages, their bodies already partially transformed by exposure to cosmic influences, their voices producing harmonies that seemed to come from distant stars. Iron Sultanate warriors, their throats enhanced with mechanical augmentations, brought industrial precision to the organic chaos of the choir. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the civilians who began to arrive. Drawn by the song from settlements that had thought themselves safely distant from the war, they came in family groups, fathers and mothers, children and grandparents, all walking with the same slack-jawed expression of musical possession. The organist welcomed them all, his smile growing wider with each new throat added to his collection. The children's voices were particularly prized, their high, clear tones adding an ethereal quality to the composition that made even hardened veterans weep blood. But it was not cruelty that drove the organist to include them. It was artistic necessity. The song demanded every possible vocal range, every conceivable harmony, regardless of the age or innocence of its sources. As the choir continued to expand, the chamber itself began to change. The stone walls stretched upward, the ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to extend infinitely above them. New levels appeared, circular galleries that allowed the growing chorus to be arranged in precise acoustic formations. The original pipe organ was joined by additional instruments, harps strung with copper wire, drums made from hollowed-out rib cages, wind instruments carved from human bones. But at the center of it all remained the original throat pipes, including those that had once belonged to 3rd Penitent Squad. Their voices anchored the composition, their military training allowing them to maintain perfect pitch and timing even as the song grew more complex around them. They had become the foundation upon which the entire diabolic symphony was built. The organist's hands had grown to match the expanding instrument, his fingers elongating and splitting to allow him to play multiple keys simultaneously. His own throat had been modified as well, opened not just horizontally but vertically as well, creating a cross-shaped wound that pulsed with each beat of his heart. When he sang, his voice emerged not as a single tone but as a complete chord, all 4 vocal ranges present simultaneously. Time became meaningless in the expanding chamber. The song seemed to create its own temporal flow, moments stretching into hours while hours compressed into seconds. The throat pipes that had been Matthias, Jacob, Dimitri, Lucian, and Thorn experienced centuries of performance in what might have been minutes. Their consciousness stretched across eons of diabolic harmony. They sang of things that had never been, of wars that had never ended, of gods that had never died. Their voices carried the weight of universal damnation, the sound of every soul that had ever been lost to sin and corruption. And with each note they produced, the boundaries between reality and nightmare grew thinner, the physical world reshaping itself to match the twisted vision contained within the song. The war above ground had transformed completely. What had once been a conflict between human factions had become something far grander and more terrible, a cosmic symphony played out on a stage that encompassed the entire world. Every explosion was now a carefully timed percussion strike, every battle cry a precisely pitched vocal contribution to the overall composition. Cities rearranged themselves to better resonate with the song, their streets forming patterns that channeled sound waves in specific directions. Mountains cracked along fault lines that corresponded to musical intervals, while rivers changed course to follow melodic progressions carved into the earth itself. The very landscape had become an instrument, and the choir of nails was learning to play it with increasing skill. But even as their influence expanded beyond all previous bounds, the organist knew that the song was still incomplete. There remained one final voice that was needed, one ultimate harmony that would allow the composition to achieve its full potential. This voice could not be taken by force or coercion, could not be added through surgical modification or copper wire manipulation. It had to be given freely, willingly, as an act of conscious choice, rather than mystical compulsion. And the organist knew exactly who possessed the voice he needed. Somewhere in the war-torn landscape above, there was a singer whose throat had never been touched by blade or fire, whose vocal cords remained pure and unscarred, whose faith was so perfect that it resonated with divine frequencies. This was the voice that would complete the choir of nails, the final throat pipe that would transform their diabolic symphony into something that could challenge heaven itself. But finding this perfect singer would require patience, careful planning, and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment when faith and despair balanced on the edge of a razor. The organist's smile grew even wider as he contemplated the hunt to come. His fingers continued their eternal dance across the bone keys, his throat producing chords that reality itself struggled to contain. Around him, the ever-expanding choir sang on, their voices weaving together in harmonies that grew more complex with each passing moment. And deep within their transformed throats, the members of 3rd Penitent Squad continued to maintain their vigil, their consciousness fragmented but unbroken, their souls serving as unwilling witnesses to the greatest musical atrocity in human history. They had been ordered to investigate the source of unauthorized music in an abandoned trench. Instead, they had become that music, their voices forever part of a composition that grew more terrible and more beautiful with each note they were forced to sing. The choir of nails had claimed them completely, body and soul, and through their sacrifice, the organist's masterwork continued its inexorable march toward completion. In the galleries above, new arrivals continued to stream in, drawn by the irresistible pull of the song. Entire armies had abandoned their positions to answer the choir's call, while civilian populations emptied whole cities in their desperate need to add their voices to the growing symphony. The throat pipes multiplied like cancer cells, organic growths spreading across every available surface, each one precisely tuned to contribute its part to the diabolic harmony. The copper wires that connected them pulsed with electrical currents that had nothing to do with earthly science, their metallic conductors carrying not just sound, but something far more fundamental. The very essence of music itself, distilled into its purest and most corrupting form. Where the wires touched stone, the rock began to sing. Where they brushed against metal, the iron joined the chorus. Nothing remained silent in the presence of the choir of nails. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what happened to those who tried to resist the song's influence. Scattered throughout the chamber were the desiccated remains of individuals who had attempted to block their ears, to refuse participation in the diabolic performance. Their bodies had been preserved by the unique acoustic properties of the space, mummified by sound waves that had slowly leached all moisture from their flesh. These silent corpses served as a warning to any who might consider resistance. In the presence of the choir of nails, silence itself was an act of rebellion that would not be tolerated. The song demanded participation, required engagement, insisted upon total submission to its rhythmic will. Those who would not sing were condemned to eternal listening, their consciousness trapped within desiccated shells that could hear but never respond. The organist occasionally paused in his playing to study these failures, his filed teeth clicking together in what might have been amusement or disappointment. Each silent corpse represented a voice that could have been part of his masterwork, a harmony that had been lost to stubborn pride or misguided faith. But he did not mourn their passing, for the song itself was compensation enough, growing richer and more complex with each throat pipe that joined its ranks. As the composition approached what might generously be called its climax, the very air within the chamber began to thicken, taking on properties that had more in common with liquid than gas. Breathing became unnecessary for the performers, their transformed physiology drawing sustenance directly from the acoustic vibrations that surrounded them. The music had become their food, their water, their very life force. The throat pipes that had once been human beings found their consciousness fragmenting further, individual identity dissolving into the collective harmony of the choir. They were no longer Matthias or Jakob or any of the others, but merely components in a vast musical instrument whose purpose transcended any single voice or melody. Their memories became shared experiences, their thoughts merging into a singular musical consciousness that spanned the entire chamber. Through this collective awareness, they perceived the full scope of what they had become part of. The choir of nails was not merely a collection of stolen voices or a diabolic performance piece. It was a key, a tool designed to unlock barriers that had kept certain forces contained since the dawn of time. Each voice added to its ranks brought it closer to achieving the harmonic resonance necessary to break through the walls between dimensions. The song they sang was older than Christianity, older than any human religion. It predated the concept of good and evil, existing in a primordial state where music was the fundamental force that shaped reality itself. The organist had not created this composition so much as discovered it, uncovering melodies that had been hidden in the mathematics of creation since the first note was sung into existence. But discovery was not enough. The song required performance, needed voices to give it form and substance in the physical world. Every throat pipe in the choir was both instrument and sacrifice, their individual lives surrendered to serve a purpose far greater than any human understanding could encompass. They were no longer people, but rather living symbols in a musical language that spoke directly to the fundamental structures of existence. As the performance continued, reality itself began to show signs of strain. The laws of physics flickered like candle flames in a hurricane, gravity becoming negotiable while time flowed in patterns that followed musical rather than chronological logic. In some parts of the chamber, cause preceded effect, while in others, the same events repeated in harmonic intervals that created echoes across multiple timelines. The throat pipes could perceive all of this happening, their enhanced awareness allowing them to witness the gradual dissolution of everything they had once considered permanent and unchangeable. The war that had raged for 8 centuries was revealed to be merely one movement in a vast symphony that encompassed all of human history. Every conflict and every peace treaty serving as notes in a composition that stretched from the creation of the world to its inevitable conclusion. And still the organist played on, his transformed hands moving across keys that had multiplied beyond counting, his cross-shaped throat producing harmonies that contained entire universes of meaning. His smile had become a permanent fixture, stretched so wide that it threatened to split his skull in half, revealing the musical mechanism that had replaced his brain. For he was no longer human either, had not been human for centuries, before the first member of 3rd Penitent Squad had stumbled into his web. He was the song itself given flesh, the physical manifestation of melodies that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal comprehension. His consciousness was distributed across every throat pipe in the choir, his will expressed through the voices of the damned who served his artistic vision. The chamber continued to expand, its walls stretching to encompass territories that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. New galleries appeared to house the ever-growing choir, while additional organs sprouted from the living rock like musical fungi. The acoustic properties of the space had become so refined that individual thoughts could be heard as distinct melodies, while emotions registered as harmonic progressions that colored the overall composition. Through their collective consciousness, the throat pipes that had once been 3rd Penitent Squad became aware of a disturbance in the song's perfect structure. Somewhere in the expanding web of voices, a discordant note had appeared, a single throat pipe that was singing slightly off-key. The imperfection was minute, barely perceptible to ordinary hearing, but in a composition that demanded absolute precision. Even the smallest flaw created ripples of dissonance that threatened the entire performance. The organist's fingers paused momentarily on the bone keys, his cross-shaped throat emitting a questioning chord that reverberated through the chamber. His consciousness swept across the choir, searching for the source of the imperfection, his attention focusing on each voice in turn like a malevolent spotlight. When he found the offending throat pipe, his smile faltered for the first time in centuries. It was one of the children, a girl no more than 10 years old whose throat had been among the most recent additions to the choir. Her voice had been pure when she first arrived, her vocal cords unmarked by age or corruption, her faith innocent and complete. But something had changed during her transformation. Some essential quality had been altered in ways that the organist had not anticipated. The copper wires that threaded through her larynx pulsed with irregular rhythms, their metallic surfaces tarnished by exposure to something that should not have existed within the chamber. Where other throat pipes glowed with the phosphorescent light of diabolic harmony, hers flickered with a different radiance, an illumination that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the boundaries of the cursed space. The organist's elongated fingers moved across the control mechanisms that governed her voice, attempting to correct the dissonance through mechanical adjustment. But the more he manipulated the copper connections, the more pronounced the discordant note became. Her throat was rejecting the song, fighting against the musical corruption that had claimed every other voice in the choir. Through the collective consciousness, the other throat pipes could perceive what was happening. The child's faith had not been destroyed by her transformation, had not been corrupted by exposure to the diabolic harmonies. Instead, it had been concentrated, refined by suffering into something purer and more powerful than anything the organist had encountered before. Her discordant note was not actually discord at all, but rather a different kind of music entirely. Where the choir of nails sang of damnation and despair, her voice carried echoes of something else, something that predated even the ancient melodies that formed the foundation of the composition. She was singing the song that had been sung at the moment of creation, the original harmony from which all other music had been derived. The organist's smile disappeared entirely as he realized the implications. His masterwork, the composition he had spent centuries perfecting, was being undone by a single child's voice. Not destroyed, but rather revealed for what it truly was, a corruption of something infinitely more beautiful and more terrible than any diabolic symphony could ever hope to achieve. The child's throat pipe began to glow brighter, its radiance spreading to the copper wires that connected it to the other voices. Where her light touched their surfaces, the metallic conductors began to change, their tarnished bronze brightening to something that resembled gold. The effect spread slowly, but inexorably through the network of connections, each wire becoming a conduit for the original song that the child continued to sing. Other throat pipes began to remember things they had forgotten, melodies they had known before their corruption, harmonies that spoke of redemption rather than damnation. The members of Third Penitent Squad felt their individual consciousnesses beginning to reassert themselves, their personalities struggling against the collective musical identity that had subsumed them. But the organist was not defenseless. His fingers moved across the bone keys with desperate urgency, calling upon harmonies so ancient and so powerful that reality itself recoiled from their expression. The chamber shook as competing musical forces clashed, diabolic symphonies warring against celestial harmonies in a battle that transcended physical sound. The throat pipes caught between these opposing forces began to tear apart, their flesh unable to withstand the conflicting pressures of holy and unholy music. Some exploded in sprays of blood and copper wire, their voices silenced forever. Others stretched and distorted, their anatomy reshaping itself to accommodate frequencies that should not have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. Through it all, the child continued to sing her impossible song, her voice growing stronger, even as her physical form began to disintegrate under the strain. The silver hooks that held her throat open started to melt, their blessed metal unable to contain the power that flowed through her vocal cords. But still she sang, her melody cutting through the diabolic composition like a blade through rotten silk. The organist's own throat began to show signs of damage, the cross-shaped wound widening as blood poured from the corners of his mouth. His elongated fingers cramped and seized, several of them snapping off entirely as the bone keys they pressed became too hot to touch. But he continued to play, his will driving his broken body beyond its physical limitations. The battle between the songs reached a crescendo that shattered the remaining windows in churches hundreds of miles away. Across the war-torn landscape, soldiers on both sides found themselves weeping without understanding why, their tears mixing with the mud of no man's land to create puddles that reflected stars that had died millennia ago. In the chamber itself, the very walls began to sing, their stone surfaces vibrating with harmonies that made mathematical equations visible in the air. The throat pipes that survived the initial onslaught found their voices changing, some joining the child's celestial melody while others clung desperately to the organist's diabolic composition. The choir was tearing itself apart, two incompatible musical forces occupying the same acoustic space. But as the child's voice reached its final note, something unexpected happened. Instead of triumph or destruction, there was synthesis. The two songs, diabolic and celestial, began to merge into something entirely new, a harmony that contained both damnation and redemption, both despair and hope. The child's throat pipe flared with a light that was neither holy nor unholy, but something that transcended such simple categorizations. The organist's broken fingers found new keys, his damaged throat producing sounds that had never been heard in any earthly or unearthly realm. For the first time in centuries, his smile returned, but it was different now, touched with something that might have been wonder or terror or both. He was no longer playing the choir of nails, nor was he being defeated by the child's celestial song. Instead, he was discovering a third composition, one that used both melodies as foundational elements in a musical structure of unimaginable complexity. The surviving throat pipes felt their consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual identity, beyond the collective awareness of the choir, into something vast and incomprehensible. They were no longer human beings trapped in a diabolic instrument, nor were they voices in a celestial chorus. They had become something else entirely, components in a musical entity that existed across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. Through their transformed perception, they could see the true scope of what they had become part of. The war that had raged for 8 centuries was not ending, nor was it being redeemed. Instead, it was being revealed as one movement in a composition so vast that human minds could only grasp the tiniest fragments of its structure. Every death in battle, every prayer in desperation, every act of courage or cowardice was a note in this ultimate symphony, The child's throat pipe flickered one final time before dissolving entirely, her physical form unable to contain the musical forces she had unleashed. But her voice remained, woven permanently into the fabric of the new composition, her sacrifice creating a harmonic bridge between realms that had been separate since the dawn of creation. The organist's hands moved across keys that now numbered in the thousands. His consciousness expanded to encompass not just the chamber but entire continents, entire worlds where similar choirs sang similar songs and variations that created a musical multiverse of impossible complexity. He was no longer a single entity but rather a conducting principle, orchestrating performances that spanned dimensions and epochs. The throat pipes that had been Third Penitent Squad found their individual memories fading, not destroyed but rather absorbed into a larger narrative that contained every human experience that had ever been or ever would be. They were still themselves in some sense, but they were also everyone else who had ever lived. Their consciousness distributed across a network of voices that sang the history of existence itself. In the world above, the war continued, but it was no longer the same conflict that had begun 8 centuries earlier. Soldiers marched to different rhythms, their battles following musical patterns that created beauty even in the midst of destruction. Cities rebuilt themselves according to harmonic principles, while the dead rose from their graves not as zombies, but as additional voices in the ever-expanding choir of reality. But none of this was resolution, merely transformation. The questions that had driven Third Penitent Squad into the abandoned trench remained unanswered. Mysteries compounded by greater mysteries until the very concept of answers became meaningless. They had discovered the source of the unauthorized music, but in doing so, they had learned that all music was unauthorized, that every song was both sacred and profane, both creation and destruction. The chamber continued to expand, its walls now encompassing territories that existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the silence that preceded the first word ever spoken. The choir of nails sang on, but it was no longer the choir of nails, just as its voices were no longer the voices of the damned. It had become something that had no name because naming required separation, and separation was antithetical to the unity that the music created. In the deepest part of their transformed consciousness, what remained of Matthias Vorn tried to remember why they had come to this place, what orders they had been following, what enemy they had been sent to fight. But the memory slipped away like water through cupped hands, replaced by melodies that contained entire lifetimes of experience compressed into single notes. The organist's smile had become a permanent feature of the landscape, visible from orbiting angels and distant stars alike. His fingers continued their eternal dance, but the music they created was no longer confined to the chamber or even to the physical world. It spilled across dimensions, infected other realities, seeded new universes with the fundamental song that gave structure to chaos and meaning to void. And still the performance was not complete, would never be complete, because completion implied ending, and the music had transcended such limitations. It existed in a state of eternal becoming, forever approaching but never reaching the final note that would bring silence. The throat pipes sang not because they were compelled to do so, but because silence had become impossible, unthinkable, a concept that had no meaning in a reality where every atom vibrated with musical intention. Somewhere in the endless galleries, new voices continued to arrive, drawn not by compulsion, but by recognition. They came because they heard their own song reflected in the diabolic harmony, their own story told in melodies that had been waiting for them since before their birth. Each new throat pipe added not just sound but meaning, not just harmony but narrative complexity to the composition that had swallowed the world. The members of 3rd Penitent Squad, now distributed across multiple throat pipes and countless dimensions, felt a presence approaching that was somehow familiar. Through the acoustic maze of the chamber, they perceived footsteps that marched to a rhythm they recognized, voices raised in a hymn they remembered learning in childhood, before the war, before the corruption, before the music had claimed them all. But recognition brought no comfort, only the terrible understanding that every cycle was beginning again, that new squads would be sent to investigate unauthorized music, that new voices would be added to the choir, that the song would continue to grow and change and spread until every throat in existence had been conscripted into its service. The approaching soldiers carried rifles blessed with oil from the martyr's shrine, their ammunition inscribed with prayers that had lost all meaning, their faith as pure and doomed as that of every squad that had come before them. They would find the shrine to St. Polycarp, the throat blessed, would enter the tunnel system, would discover the performance chamber, and take their place in the ever-expanding choir. And the organist would smile, his filed teeth gleaming in the phosphorescent light, his cross-shaped throat producing harmonies that reality struggled to contain, his elongated fingers finding new keys to accommodate new voices in the composition that had no beginning and would have no end. The song continued, patient and eternal, waiting for the next verse to be added, the next harmony to be discovered, the next throat to be opened and wired into the magnificent and terrible instrument that sang the world into its final form.